Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, ve'chol levavcha, uve'chol nafshecha, uve'chol me'odecha. So of course, the Shema. And I'm hoping that we have enough time to end with the Shema, having begun with the Shema, because I want to talk just a little bit about that. But tonight, hopefully you already got a piece of bread. There's the bags. If you didn't, they are available at the back of the auditorium there. So in my researching of a variety of things, one of the things that I came across is this idea that some call, that some call the Holy Trinity of food. You probably get the idea. The basic idea is that there are three things that are food items that generally are accepted to be the most important three things that people would eat, living back in Bible times. Those three things are bread, wine, and olives or olive oils. Just sort of an olive product, if you will. So these three things were considered to be the very most important of all food items, and so they were staples of most daily existence. So if you remember, one of the passages that we read early on that comes from the long list of scriptures that are a part of the Shema, from Deuteronomy 11, 13, and 14, it says, "If you will indeed obey my commandments that I command you today, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, he will give you the rain for your land in its season, the early rain and the later rain, that you may gather in your grain and your wine and your oil." Those three things, the grain, the wine, and the oil. Grain, of course, producing bread. So those references there, clear indicator of blessings of God are having an abundance of grain, wine, and oil. Whenever God is satisfied with his people, he says, if you serve me, I'm going to give you plenty of rain so that your crops grow and produce grain, wine, and oil. That's always, again, an indicator of God's blessings. So much could be said about each of these items, the bread and the wine and the oil, but because of crazy Texas weather, last week we were freezing and this week I'm in short sleeves, we're missing a couple of weeks. So we're going to be just dealing with one of them. So I have brought actually some bread, and again, you should have some, but the loaves, my towel is bigger than I remember. The loaves, they come out something like this. It's leavened as opposed to unleavened, but you can taste it. That's why I brought it. You can get to taste what it looks like. This is a bread that's made from a whole grain. That is a recipe, again, based on some research that other people have done that I came across, that they found a recipe that makes bread that theoretically is very much like what would have been available in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean region of the time. So this is a whole grain. It has pearled barley in it. That's kind of the grains you'll see, as well as a bulgur, which is something that I only recently learned even existed. And it's a whole wheat, and it has honey and these kinds of things in it. So we baked it fresh in this kitchen over here. You may have smelled it I hope you smelled it when you walked in. That's why I baked it there. Anyway, good stuff. I have really enjoyed in eating some of this. I made it once before. So there's always a blessing that's said over the bread in Hebrew. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam hamotzi lechem min ha'aretz. And so we'll translate that later. So this to say, bread was a daily staple. This particular recipe for bread is referred to by those that researched it as what you might call daily bread. And so whenever seasons were strained and there was famine in the land, long after you quit eating meats and vegetables and fruits, you were always eating bread. And if and when the bread ever ran out, everything was gone. That was the last thing you had. For instance, an example of this, if you remember the widow of Zarephath, 1 Kings 17, right? Elijah comes to her and she says, after Elijah has asked for something to eat and something to drink, "As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. And now I'm gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." All that they had left was bread, and this was it. We're done. We're in dire straits. But we know the miracle that occurred, right? That the jug of oil and the jar of flour never ran out as long as Elijah was there, until the rain came once again, so God provided for their survival. And in a familiar passage from the New Testament, we read a little bit about bread in the Lord's Prayer, Matthew 6, right? It says, "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. And forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." So Jesus was saying, give us every single day our daily bread. We depend upon God for our very survival. And you always need just enough, at least, for today. And it reminds me, of course, of the Exodus. During all the years that they were wandering through the wilderness, God provided daily for the needs of the entire nation of Israel by sending bread. Of course, it came in the form of manna, which apparently was a grain-like substance that they said looks like coriander. And this manna, whenever it was baked, would taste like cakes baked with honey. If you don't know, coriander is the seed that actually grows the cilantro plant, which I think is kind of interesting. So God provided daily bread for these people every single day for 40 years in the wilderness. Well, except for the Sabbath, right? But they had twice as much the day before. So bread was literally critical to their survival in the wilderness. Meal times, every day, bread. And I think it makes sense of some of the complaints that they would give, because at the time, meat, fruit, and vegetables were treats, not a guarantee. And if you had recollection of the complaints of the Israelites, they would always say, we remember the food that we had in Egypt, the meat pots, the leeks, the cucumbers, the garlic, all these things. And it was not guaranteed. You don't always get those things. You get bread. All we have is this manna to look at. But I think most of us, even today, we don't appreciate bread nearly as much as we should, at least not in my opinion, and I would include myself. We do. I include myself in the category, really. Because I want to make note of something. If you think about seasons, if you want tomatoes, or if you want some apples or a pineapple or something like this, what do? You go to the store, and you can, I just realized I had this in my pocket. You can buy all of those things. It doesn't matter what the season is. How does that work? Greenhouses, shipping, all these kinds of things. We can get foods grown in other parts of the world, and they send them to where you are. This was definitely not possible 2,000 years ago. Those things didn't exist. You got things that were in season, and in season only. As a result, bread was oftentimes the only option you had, because the grain that's needed to make bread, it can actually be stored for quite a length of time without spoiling. Unlike fruits and vegetables, unless you can them, those rot very quickly. They become ripe on the vine. 2 weeks or less, they're done. You don't get to keep them for long. And so these grains could be stored in large storehouses, and they would keep many seasons, really, just dry. And so most all houses of the time had some kind of means of storing food supplies, similar to what you might have in a pantry, but their storehouses were much more critical to them than a pantry would be to us. If you recall, there's the story from Luke chapter 12, the rich fool, right? It speaks to this idea, the parable where the man says, I've got so many crops and my barns can't even hold it. I'm going to tear those puppies down, build some bigger barns, sit back, eat and drink, and be merry. And of course, you fool, this very night your soul is demanded of you. But that's the idea. I've got plenty. I can sit back and just relax. And he puts all of this into his storehouses, his barns, because they stored excess food in those kinds of things, especially grain. Now, because of this, you could think of it as the family's 401k. Their retirement plan was very much tied to their storehouse. Because you would need to have a good storehouse of grains and things like this in order to have some kind of security for the future, because famines do come. Rains do ebb and flow. And in the seasons that were sparse, you were totally dependent on your storehouse of grain. Another good example of that, if you think about Genesis with Joseph The whole reason he got to be second in command in Egypt is because he said there's going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. We should store extra during the 7 good years and have it for the 7 years of famine, right? That idea of the storehouses was critical for the world in that area's survival during those 7 years of famine. So all of these things point to the need, the dependence on bread, the dependence on grain. You may not harvest many or any vegetables or fruits, but even then, they would only be available during season. But bread was available much more than that. So before researching this subject, I was thinking that Bible times bread was only unleavened. But that's not true. They had yeast. They had leavened bread. They did make unleavened bread, of course, but that was usually only for very specific things or events. And so from my research, I think this is interesting, that I learned in the air in the Mediterranean region, in the Middle East, there's enough yeast that's just naturally occurring in the air that if you leave your dough out, it will leaven on its own, and it will rise by itself. And when we think about the Exodus account from the Passover, it actually indicates that people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks on their shoulders, right? So they hadn't leavened it yet. And so in recollection of the Exodus event, they don't put leaven in there. So they have the Passover feast with unleavened bread, and then the feast of unleavened bread for the whole week. No leaven in there to remember this particular event. And so there are modern accounts, because I was a little skeptical of this whenever I first heard it. But there are modern accounts that I researched. People do blogs and things like this, and they make sourdough, and they literally put water in their dough, and they set it on the counter without putting any yeast in it. And after a couple days, it has risen. It has risen by itself without adding any yeast to it. So I thought that was interesting, that indeed there is enough yeast even in the air now that it would self-leaven, and enough naturally occurring on the grains themselves. So if you don't cook it right away, it will leaven on its own. And this also makes sense because there's a kind of a funny modern Jewish rule that I learned. If you're making unleavened bread for the Passover or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you, from the time the water hits the flour until it goes in the oven and you're done with this whole process, must be less than 18 minutes. And it seems sort of arbitrary. I was like, 18 minutes? How'd you come up? But apparently, they understand that after 18 minutes, once the water has hit the flour, it's too leavened to count as unleavened bread. And I was like, I never knew that. But I thought that was interesting. So that to say, there was daily bread, which is much more along these lines, and then there is unleavened bread. The unleavened bread being much more used for temple or tabernacle worship, and for the feast, of course, of unleavened bread. But the more common daily bread that you might eat was actually much more likely to be light and fluffy. So one of the things that God promised the people, Deuteronomy chapter 8, he was explaining the land that they're coming into, the land of promise, that he said this is a good land. So starting in verse 7. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs, flowing out in the valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron and out of whose hills you can dig copper. And you shall eat and be full, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Again, God says this is a good land. You're going to eat wheat and barley. You're going to have olives, oil, all of these things. You will lack nothing. You will eat bread without scarcity. This is a good land, flowing with milk and honey, right? Now, whenever the people had wandered from God and the prophets are starting to come and speak against them, there's a passage from Amos chapter 4 that I think speaks to the idea of the punishment of God, because we have the blessing of God that says you're going to have an abundance, but the punishment that ultimately is, I'm trying to bring you back to me. He comes along and says, I gave you cleanness of teeth in all your cities, not pearly whites. They're clean because you aren't eating anything, right? Cleanness of teeth in all your cities and lack of bread in all your places, yet you did not return to me. declares the Lord. I also withheld the rain from you when there were yet 3 months to the harvest. I would send rain on one city and send no rain on another city. One field would have rain, and the field on which it did not rain would wither. So 2 or 3 cities would wander to another city to drink water and would not be satisfied. Yet you did not return to me, declares the Lord. So this punishment, this trying to bring the people to repentance, to come back, was like, I'm not giving you what you need because you have left. But they still wouldn't return. So famine striking and rain being lacking were very real problems. And whenever your daily bread was starting to run out, you were in serious, dire straits. You couldn't order it from somewhere else. It was just gone. And I was thinking about in 2020, one of the things that seemed to have left grocery store shelves, if you remember, I didn't actually take this picture, but I was trying to find, I did take one very much like it, and I guess I deleted it. The flour was gone. And I was like, that's so strange to me because hardly anybody bakes homemade bread anymore. But all of a sudden, the flour was gone during the pandemic. Suddenly, people seemed to be interested in daily bread, if you will. When adversity struck, what did we go get? The necessities to make bread, which is kind of interesting. So something that I didn't know about bread that really changed my perspective on something that we hear from Jesus, it actually comes from Matthew chapter 15, is the use of bread at the time. So this is from a book that I've been reading that they researched the food and so forth. I referenced it earlier. It's called The Food and Feasts of Jesus. So they say this about bread. Bread was used as an eating utensil to scoop beans or grains and absorb sauces and gravies, much like we might do today. But it was also used as a napkin. Diners literally wiped the grease and sauce from their hands with a clean piece of bread and dropped the soiled bread on the floor to be eaten by the family dogs. Can you picture this in your dining room? We can imagine that these dogs were actually quite well fed, maybe eating bones and scraps along with the soiled bread. So, this is the Matthew 15 reference. When the Canaanite woman said to Jesus that even the dogs eat the crumbs from the table, she was talking about some pretty substantial crumbs. Certainly, I think this is very different from the picture of our dinner table and the crumbs under our dinner table. Unless you have very small children that are just learning to eat, your pets would starve if they lived off of the crumbs from your tables. So this Canaanite woman was referring to something much more substantial in terms of her request from Jesus. Essentially saying, there's enough bread on the table that you throw entire pieces on the floor after wiping your hands. Surely you have enough left over from the bounty of your ministry to your own people to help my sick daughter. And learning about this, I was like, well, that totally changed the way I thought about this parable, that bread, without scarcity, you would even just use it as a napkin and drop it on the ground. Almost like peanut shells at the Texas Roadhouse, right? So I do want to look at a gospel account from Mark chapter 6. This is one that you're definitely going to be familiar with, but I want to take the time to read it because I think it's worth reading together. So Mark chapter 6, picking up in verse 30. It's the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on water. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and had taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them. And they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by fifties. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing, and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. A curious question that I've always had: why does it say that they did not understand about the loaves? Such a weird place to put that phrase, because Jesus had just come walking on the water. I would much more readily have said they didn't understand that he could walk on the water, or why he came walking. Why the loaves? I don't understand. So it led me to ask 2 questions. Why did he multiply the bread, and why did he walk on the water? And I think they both have the same conclusion. These being good Jewish men, I think they would know their Psalms very well. Very likely have many of them totally memorized, word for word. And so they may have thought, perhaps, of Psalm 77, verse 11 through 20. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. I will ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your might among the peoples. You, with your arm, redeemed your people, the children of Jacob and Joseph. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lighted up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Whose way is through the sea? Whose footprints go unseen? And what is it that Jesus had just done? He was walking on water where you don't leave footprints. There are no footprints to be seen when the water closes over them. His way was literally through the sea. Just like God. But why the bread? Of course, we've already mentioned several Old Testament references to bread and its significance, and how God said that the promised land was a good land. They would have no scarcity of bread. They would lack nothing. During the wilderness, God provided bread daily for them via the manna. It was clear that when they were obeying God, he was going to provide bread for them. Bread was critical. But there's a specific phrase that I wanted to take note of in Mark 6, verse 41. It says that Jesus looked to heaven and he said a blessing. Then he broke the bread. So this is the traditional blessing over bread that Jews would say. I said it at the beginning of class, and I want to look at it now. And I personally believe that it is very likely that this is the blessing that he spoke over the bread. Of course, it's not written down, so we don't know this, but it seems very likely that this is what he said. So I want to translate this. It's Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. which means, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth." The words of the blessing alone, I believe, give us the answer to why Jesus made bread for the masses. Who is the one who brings forth bread from the earth? Melech haolam, the King of the universe. Only the King of the universe. Who is the one whose way goes through the sea, where his footprints are unseen? Again, the King of the universe. El Shaddai, God Almighty, and no other can do those things. So why did it say they didn't understand about the loaves? I suspect it's because they totally missed Jesus' identity, that he is the King of the universe. He is God in the flesh, and only God brings forth bread from the earth and has a way that goes through the sea. Jesus is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. His multiplying of the bread absolutely confirms exactly who Jesus is. But I think they missed it, which is why they didn't understand about the loaves. On a somewhat unrelated note, but what we started with tonight and what we began this series with, the Shema. I want to talk about this for just a second to close our series of classes with this. What does it mean? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, or he is God alone. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. I want to look at those three things, heart, soul, and might. From the Hebrew, and we're going to be slightly out of order, but there's a reason. The Hebrew, the levavcha, right? The heart is the inner man. It's the indefinite of the soul. It's the comprehending mind, or affections and will. It's the things that go on inside of you, where you think and you consider things. Me'od, me'odecha, that last word. This is a word that you would frequently see, like if God blesses Abraham exceedingly greatly, it will say me'od, me'od. And it's like this exceedingness, this greatness, this abundance. In one of the words, it says muchness. I was like, that's not a word I use. I don't ever say muchness. But it's force or might. Your muchness or your abundance is your me'od, me'odecha, right? But this one, nefesh, nafshecha, that word is a very complicated word. Whenever you look at the list of definitions, there's literally 10 of them. And one of them says, if this one, then it actually can mean all three of the previous. It's like very complicated. But nefesh, I think, is important. In the beginning, when God created life and he breathes breath into the nostrils of the basar, the flesh of Adam, he becomes a nefesh, a living being. And the same is true of animals. Whenever they are living beings, they have nefesh. The nefesh is a living being whose life resides in their blood. But this is where it gets a little bit more interesting, because it's not only that, but it's also, nefesh is the seat of appetites. It's your emotions and passions, such as your desire, abhorrence or loathing, sorrow, joy, and love. All of these things flow from the nefesh. And also, this is the form that is used in Deuteronomy 6 and 5, the nafshecha there. This word carries multiple meanings, as I've said. And ultimately, it is the acts of the mind, it's the acts of the character, and acts of the will. So if I'm supposed to love God with my nafshecha, my nefesh, my acts of mind, character, and will, and my living being self, whenever I think about those words, whenever I hear them in English, if you say, love the Lord your God with all your soul, I don't really understand that. That sort of goes over my head. So digging into this helped me sort of change my understanding of it. What I came to is that with all those things that are in your mind, with all the things that you do, and with all of your emotions, with all of your thoughts, with everything that you are that makes you a living and breathing human being, all of those things, love God. And do this with great abundance and strength, your muchness, your me'odecha. And whenever your love of God is so strong that it permeates you through and through, it guides you in everything you do, it drives you through everything you do, and it will restore you when you are broken. I believe that that kind of love of God will absolutely influence and change your outer life through and through, tremendously. And so whenever I consider all of these Jewish customs and traditions and the things that we've been discussing, they're all very much physical things that were supposed to be done, not always actually done, but they were supposed to be done by the Jews. And I'm like, maybe they're not so bad, all of these physical rituals that they would do. Historically, and I'm not saying that this is true, but historically, I feel like what I got and what I was taught was that the Old Testament was essentially kind of a throwaway part of Scripture. All you need is the New Testament, was kind of taught to me. And as I have learned more and more about what the Old Testament is and how the Jews lived with their customs and what it exactly is that God gave to his people in the law, I have decided that the Old Testament is anything but a throwaway part of Scripture. It brings life and meaning and richness to the things that Jesus did and the things that he said that I never understood until I started studying all of these things, and it has enriched my spiritual life in many regards. So I would also include that we are not bound by the Old Testament, by the old law anymore. But I promise you that we have a lot to learn from it and a lot to gain from it. And so I want to close and just say to you all, be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened or dismayed. Do not turn from God's words to the right hand or to the left. He will be with you wherever you go. Only be strong and very courageous.